Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Ask an Expert session that is focusing on advanced nuclear. My name is Sarah Golden, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Kirsty Gogan, who's founder and managing partner at TerraPraxis, and Isabelle Boemeke. Did I say that right? Boemeke. Boemeke, who's a fashion model and a nuclear energy influencer, and is actually the first time that I have ever had a social media influencer on the VERGE stage before. So I'm incredibly excited to have these two speakers today. And we're going to be talking about a topic that is incredibly important within the energy transition and is also incredibly contentious. And so it's something that I'm looking forward to digging into a bit more. If you have never attended an Ask an Expert session, this is how it works. The content of this session is really based around trying to answer the questions that everybody here has about advanced nuclear. And so we encourage you to ask questions on the right side of your screen. You should see these toggles that say chat, polls, people, Q&A. Click over to the Q&A and you can ask questions there. You can just type it up. We'll be monitoring those. And you can also upvote questions if you see a question that you want us to hit on. So don't be shy. Put your questions in there and we'll answer them as we get to them. To start out, I would love to hear a little bit more from Kirsty and Isabelle. So to start out, could you introduce yourself and explain what advanced nuclear is? Kirsty, I'm going to start with you.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. Great to be here. Very excited to see everyone's questions, get stuck into this. My name is Kirsty Gogan. I'm co-founder of TerraPraxis, as you said, which is a non-profit organization. And we're focused on really sort of developing really scalable climate strategies that focus on the toughest to solve parts of the decarbonization challenge and that can be delivered within, our sort of climate timescales, 28 years to 2050 people globally throughout the world in as cost-effective a way as possible and with the least amount of disruption as possible to really sort of ensure that we de-risk the transition. And two of the big things that we're focusing on are coal, which is, represents almost half of our global emissions, incredibly. And liquid fuels. We currently use around 100 million barrels of oil per day. And the reason that I'm here talking to you about advanced nuclear is because advanced heat sources, as we would call them, have very useful characteristics in that not only can they produce really low cost electricity at a very high capacity factor, which means they generate, up to more than 90% of the time. At a very low cost if they're delivered, in a sensible way through a, manufactured model. But they also make heat. And that's what's really, the useful piece, because when you start adding high temperature heat into the production of clean synthetic fuels, or if you start using that high temperature heat to replace coal boilers to make steam in thermal energy generators, that's when you start to get, really low cost decarbonization opportunities that are really complementary to wind and solar.
Thanks for that. And Isabelle, would you introduce yourself and if you would explain quickly what you see advanced nuclear as?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. I'm so honored to be the first influencer on a VERGE stage. That means a lot. So like you said, I am a fashion model and a nuclear energy influencer. I know some of you might be rolling your eyes right now. I roll my eyes sometimes at it too, but my goal is to change really public perception and the culture around nuclear power so we can build, first of all, prevent early closures of nuclear power plants, which is the most important thing we should be doing right now, but also pave the way to build advanced reactors. And I could tell you in words what advanced nuclear is, but I thought it would be maybe a little bit more fun to just show you on one of my videos, which is about advanced nuclear. So I'll show that to you guys. Hey guys, this is my first ASMR video. ASMR, of course, stands for a small modular reactor. What? Yes, they're a whole vibe right now. It's a new generation of nuclear reactors that are smaller than the ones we have. For example, an old school reactor in California can make enough electricity for 1.5 million people. Some of these new designs can make electricity for 800,000 or even just 700 people. They're also modular, like a giant Lego. Parts are made in a factory, shipped in the back of a truck, and put together wherever the reactor is supposed to go. Okay, Queen, but like, who cares? Well, the main argument of not anti-nuclear people, they're actually anti-nuclear, is that existing plants are too slow and expensive to build. Of course, they conveniently forget that was the argument against renewables for decades. Anyway, these new designs might solve that. Some are naturally even safer than existing plants. And my favorite part, they can use nuclear waste as fuel. And just using the existing nuclear waste in the United States, we could power the whole country for at least 55 years. I hope that wasn't more confusing, but like the video said, the only valid argument in countries like the United States against nuclear power is the time to build and how expensive it is. Even though I kind of disagree with that argument, but that's not, not for now. So these new advanced reactors are supposed to be modular, they're supposed to be faster to build and cheaper as well. So we're solving for those issues.
That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I do want to get more into those two topics you just named, that idea of costs and speed, because those are the things I hear the most often when we're talking about nuclear power as a a solution for decarbonization. But first, I want to hit on one other criticism you hear with nuclear from the more like the anti-nuclear side of things, and just note that there's perceptions about safety and waste when it comes to nuclear. And so to just like address that and move on to some of those other arguments, Kirsty, could you share a little bit on your thoughts on that safety and waste issue?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm sure you all know that actually nuclear technology is the safest form of electricity generation. And it's really interesting to think about why it is that people think that the safest form of electricity generation is the most dangerous. And I think it's partly because of this that we always end up, sort of focusing on that. And actually what we don't do is think about these risks and the waste streams in the context. So, for example, we don't seem to sort of pay as much attention to the fact that fossil fuels, and I'm thinking about coal and oil and gas, are not only responsible for 8 million premature deaths per year due to air pollution, and are also contributing to climate change. Those waste streams are just being chugged out directly into the atmosphere. And by contrast, spent fuel is, very safely contained in long-term storage that's posing absolutely no risk to humans or the environment. So I think we're really focusing on the wrong things. We're focusing on the wrong waste. We need to be paying much more attention to the immediate and very severe public health impacts of fossil fuels that are very material and present, and also the long-term impacts of waste from fossil fuels. Unfortunately, these are the choices we have to make. This isn't a question of nuclear versus renewables. We need both of those things, but it really is a question of nuclear versus coal. And right now, coal is winning.
Right. So when you say the safest form of energy, what's the metric for that?
So that includes all of the famous accidents that everybody's heard of, the 3 big accidents that have happened throughout the entire 50 or 60 years of operation. In fact, coal kills more people in a single day of normal operations than all of the nuclear global operations have throughout the entire 60 years of operation, including those big accidents. So That's just to give you an idea. One day
Yeah.
of normal
Yeah.
operations.
And I'd also like to encourage a conversation. I understand what you're saying, that like the when we're talking about base load, we should be comparing it to fossil fuels. I think, I mean, I don't know, I'm a clean energy analyst. I focus on what energy sources are clean. And so in comparing it to fossil fuels, I don't think anybody is going to be defending the health benefits of fossil fuels when compared to really any other source.
Even more people die falling off a roof installing solar panels, than have been killed throughout. So in terms of safety, in terms of deaths per terawatt hour or accidents, it's kind of astonishing that nuclear energy sits right down there bumping along at the bottom. And one of the problems that the industry has is that it's constantly reassuring people about how safe it is. And it's a bit like me, marketing my airline to you by telling you the wings hardly ever fall off. We hardly ever have accidents. Would you want to fly with that airline? It's well understood in the science of risk communication that the more that you sort of, doth protest too much, you create a kind of, a counterproductive response in people. So partly this perception about safety is actually due to the industry itself constantly reminding everybody to worry about safety.
Right.
You don't get that in the fossil fuel industry. You don't get the oil industry constantly reminding us about the terrible oil spills and promising that it'll never happen again, because all that would do is continue to reinforce those negative perceptions.
Mm-hmm. So I want to jump into the 2 points that we talked about at the top that Isabelle, you mentioned in that video, is the idea that I hear the most. So my primary concern is climate change. And in my personal view, the lens should be what helps decarbonize fastest and most equitably. And then the technologies and I think we need a variety of technologies in order to achieve that. And that's part of what this energy transition is about, figuring out how all these different things interact together. And so I've always been of the view that we should be supporting different developments of advanced nuclear, but that because of the cost and the speed, it's not going to be like the immediate solution to decarbonization. And in talking to both of you, I think that you've told me that I've been consuming some narratives that aren't all correct. And so I'd like to break those into 2 different things. First, costs, because I looked up some numbers about just how expensive it's been traditionally to be building traditional nuclear reactors, and then also what that cost is per kilowatt hour compared to like solar and wind. And everything that I found had them as sort of like a magnitude different. So when we're talking about the difference of like, one study I was seeing was $36 per megawatt for compared to 189 per megawatt for nuclear. So what's missing from that? Why do you see this as the lowest cost solution for this baseload decarbonization?
Well, I'm not sure it is the lowest cost solution. I do know that nuclear energy is one of 2 technologies that have been proven and have been successful at decarbonizing grids largely. So in the example of France, which maybe some of you guys are aware, during the 70s, during the oil crisis, they decided to become energy independent, and they started a huge plan to get all of their electricity from nuclear power. And in the next 18 years, they built 42 reactors, which is quite impressive, and largely decarbonized their grid. So now they didn't get to 100%, but France gets 70% of their electricity from nuclear. It is one of the cheapest, most reliable, and cleanest electricities in Europe. When you contrast that with California and Germany, which have been investing very, very heavily on renewables, they still don't have as clean electricity as France. Now, in terms of the numbers, I'm sure Kirsty is a little more aware of the exact number per kilowatt hour. But in terms of time to build, I don't really understand that argument, because even if a nuclear power plant takes 15 years to build, it is not like in 15 years we're not going to need more energy, right? We're going to use energy forever. So why not build something that will be there in 15 years, but can also last for 80 years, which is how long we think nuclear power plants can last, or even longer, because you can replace the parts at some point. So I don't understand really the time to build argument, even for the slowest builds. And on top of that, countries like China and Russia are building even traditional reactors in 7 years or so. So I think that's a little bit of a misconception. And then also, we're not talking about the most important thing, which is the biggest strength that nuclear power has, which is its firm, clean power, meaning it is on 24/7. When you compare the cost per kilowatt hour of nuclear to the cost per kilowatt hour of solar, you're not really comparing similar things, because nuclear is on 24/7, solar is on when the sun is out. So in order to make a fair comparison, you would have to add the price of batteries or the price of whatever other form of energy you would need to add in order to make solar as reliable as nuclear. But Kirsty, maybe you have some more information on the numbers.
Yeah, that's great, Isabelle. It's exactly right. The whole system perspective is what we need, and comparing, a single technology, LCOE, which is, it doesn't matter how cheap it is if it's not generating, right? So, and actually, yeah, I totally agree with you. So, we've had some difficult experiences with recent new build projects in the United States and Europe, which have been expensive and slow. And those projects are first of a kind, first in a generation projects that required a huge investment in licensing a design for the first time in a generation and then learning how to build it. And we're already seeing with the project in the US that the first unit that was built was very difficult, very slow, very delayed and expensive. But the second unit, now that, that investment is being made, is being delivered extremely, well, and at a dramatic cost reduction from the first one. The majority of plants being delivered around the world today are being delivered for less than $3,000 a kilowatt, which is really competitive, actually, with renewables projects as well. And ultimately, this is really about being complementary in our electricity grids, but also bringing additional value to our larger decarbonization challenges, right? So it's not just about decarbonizing electricity. We have to decarbonize the other 80% of our energy use. Obviously, we'll electrify as much as we can, for which we need, guess what? We need more electricity. But we also need to decarbonize, heavy transport, which would, can't be electrified very easily. So we'll need clean synthetic fuels. So we need a lot of very low cost hydrogen that's emissions free. And, that is something that you can do extremely usefully and productively with high temperature heat sources, and indeed even with conventional big old nuclear plants. That's what's happening in the US right now. We're repurposing some of these great big old gigawatt scale light water reactors, to be able to produce hydrogen as well, or even for direct air capture. So, I think it's important that we look at the whole value proposition, and then, apply the same determination, creativity, and, business models, financial models to drive down costs. It's really, why can't we apply the same success that we've seen in wind and solar to other clean energy technologies? That's a choice.
Yeah. When I was looking at these numbers, there was one report from MIT that said that about a third of the costs of building nuclear plants in the US were associated with building it, and 2/3 of the costs were tied with what they called soft factors. And what that resulted in was a 241% overrun of nuclear projects. But when you look at some of the soft factors, those are things like the stopping and the starting. It's like bad management, it's changing things midway. And a lot of that is also responding to whatever social pressures there are. And it reminded me a little bit of when we were looking at the developing the vaccine for COVID, and all these scientists said, like, we've never developed a vaccine this quickly. But then we did, because everybody was actually dedicated to figuring something out instead of pointing to the way that things in the past had never done.
That's so well said. Yeah. In other words, we thought it was an emergency, and we acted like it was an emergency. And, we call the climate emergency an emergency, and, we don't really act like it. Maybe if we were acting like it, we could get our act together.
There's a couple of questions here that I want to turn to. One says that storage has been an unresolved issue with traditional reactors. How exactly do new reactors address this issue and make use of spent fuels?
So storage already exists. This idea that nuclear waste hasn't been resolved is a little bit of a fantasy, because we have solutions for it. Maybe people are not happy with the solutions, but we do. So for instance, in France, where again they use a lot of nuclear power, they get the spent fuel and reprocess it to extract some of the uranium, because spent fuel is actually over 90% still reusable uranium. You can recycle that, extract the uranium, reuse it for energy, and then they vitrify the waste and store it in a barrel underground. That's it. This barrel blocks radiation, so the radiation is not going anywhere. It's just there. Then what you do with that waste, you could just keep it in these barrels and just let it decay away. It is not hurting people or the environment. And in the United States, we cannot reprocess. So the spent fuel is just sitting in dry casks, again, like concrete dry casks that block all the radiation. I think one very important thing to point is that it is not a lot. So if I were to get my whole life's energy from nuclear, by the end of my life when I died, I would leave behind the equivalent of a soda can of spent fuel. So that is incredible, right? If for a person to get their whole life's energy out of one source, they would leave behind a soda can of spent fuel. And then over 90% of that is still reusable uranium. So if you recycle that, you end up with a very, very small amount that you actually have to dispose of. But to answer the other question, some of these new designs, they actually used reprocessed uranium, so they can run on quote unquote nuclear waste or spent fuel.
We have another question here about how do you create messages to generate greater social acceptance of nuclear energy? So how's that been going for you guys?
Well, Isabelle's the expert on this one, but
well, I clearly create TikTok videos. My focus is really on my generation and younger, because these are the people who are really concerned with climate change. I worry when I see teenagers saying that they have depression and anxiety, and I know a lot of people who actually don't even want to have kids because they're so afraid of climate change. So instead of concerning people more about the problem and just highlighting climate change, I decided to focus on a solution, which is nuclear power. And the way I do it is just using things that people already gravitate towards. So the video I showed is an ASMR video, which is very popular YouTube category of videos. Maybe some of you guys are very into it. And so I just try to hack social media basically to send a message of hope, send a message that we have technologies available. And, I personally don't focus on renewables just because people already love them. They don't need that support. But I think we have all these incredible technologies: solar, wind, geothermal, advanced nuclear. I mean, we do have the solutions. We just have to implement them. And that's how I do it.
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions also around water usage, and it's another perception that I have, especially of traditional nuclear, where it takes a lot of water for cooling, and sometimes those aren't closed loop systems, and so they can also create, be heating up different ecosystems around them, and then obviously there's lots of places that are in the U.S. that are experiencing mega droughts. Can you talk a little bit about the water resources needed for nuclear and what kind of solutions there could be for those?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's certainly a lot of water. If seawater, for example, that is sort of pushed through the system, that is not actually consumed. And it might be slightly warmer in a very localized sense, but given obviously the volume of the ocean, then that it's pretty negligible. And of course, it's very highly regulated as well in most countries. And actually, certainly in the UK, it's very popular for swimming and fishing around the nuclear plants. And then, the other piece, which I think is super interesting, well, the advanced reactors, of course, we're moving away from light water reactors. So, you're not going to have the same dependence on water for cooling, which creates a lot more flexibility in terms of siting. You no longer need to be close to a large body of water, which is great. And you're also, getting kind of delinking any safety issues from access to water as well, which is great. But we're really interested in the potential for using the waste heat from the advanced heat sources for desalination. So if you were to start, looking at not only direct air capture and hydrogen production and direct provision of heat for industrial purposes and domestic heating and cooling, all of those are really difficult to solve parts of our decarbonization challenge, by the way. But indeed, desalination, especially in water-stressed regions, not only in the Middle East and Asia and Africa, but on the west coast of the US as well, then we could be addressing some of our other large environmental challenges through the production of fresh water, very large amounts of fresh water.
We have a couple of questions about what's happening internationally with nuclear facilities. One is about China, and so that China was considering building up to 600 nuclear plants. Is that accurate? And did they begin on those projects? Or are they working on those? The other is about India, and that one is saying, what is the nuclear status in India? There were many nuclear deals made by George W. Bush. Are those bearing fruit?
I don't know if Isabelle, you have insights on those parts of the world there, but I mean, certainly China is leading in terms of gigawatt scale light water reactor construction right now. They've just completed 3 projects, I believe, recently. They have they're building with very experienced constructors from around the world, and they have very ambitious nuclear new build programs. And part of the reason for that is actually that that as they've successfully industrialized and modernized, they've moved air pollution from inside the home to outside by depending a lot on coal for the industrialization. And air pollution now presents a huge risk, political risk for the government. So there's a very strong political motivation to address air pollution in China, and nuclear energy is seen as a really, critical piece of that. They're also in China developing advanced reactors and just completing the first district heating reactor, which is really exciting because, again, this is a sort of bespoke reactor designed for supplying district heating. And I think it's one of the, very interesting pieces actually to see, which countries are going to be commercializing and deploying these technologies globally the soonest. Russia is also developing technologies, and the United States and Canada have a hugely entrepreneurial culture, developing, a very large number of advanced reactor designs as well, which will be applicable around the world.
We only have a couple minutes left, and there's a few more questions I want to get through, so I'm going to keep moving on. Oh, no, it's all wonderful. I wish that we had more time. One is about you're just hitting on the small-scale reactors. What kind of time frame are we looking at for when these will be market ready? I've heard different estimates in the 15-year time frame. What's the realistic time frame for these to be market ready?
In the US, the Advanced Reactor Development Program, that's almost $1 billion a year funding from the DOE, is supporting 2 reactor designs. One is Natrium, which is a joint venture between Bill Gates's company TerraPower and GE Hitachi, and the other is X Energy, and those are both targeting 2027 to be operational. So, we would expect to see these technologies coming to market with, well within this decade, hopefully in the 2027 timeframe. Terrestrial Energy in Canada, which has sponsored this session, are at the final stages of their vendor design review, which is the really important, lengthy 4-year, 5-year review by the Canadian safety regulator. They're in the final stages of that. That should complete by the end of this year, and the next stage will be to apply for a site license. So we could even see terrestrial energy being deployed and operational within the next sort of 5 or 6 years as well. So this is a critical decade for these technologies coming to market, and the question is, are we going to be ready to really deploy them at scale once they're demonstrated?
Yeah, and quickly, I have one more question. We're actually out of time, but I'm gonna just go a couple minutes over. I hope you don't have a hard stop right now. Do you know what price point some of those small scale nuclear reactors are coming in at when you say that they may be ready by 2027?
To have large markets, they need to come in at less than $3,000 a kilowatt, and that's certainly what these designers are targeting. Terrestrial energy are targeting those kinds of prices to compete with natural gas plants. They need to be competing with gas in terms of cost and performance, being able to be really flexible, very complementary to renewables, and very competitive. Sorry, Isabelle, to come in. But I wanted to give you
a
know
more about prices than I do. I know more about public perception.
The last question I want to ask you, we've gotten a couple around the impacts of uranium extraction or mining, and asking for like the full picture of when you're accounting for all these different things. Is there environmental degradation or emissions associated with the extraction of uranium mining?
Yeah, so mining is pretty terrible. And when I mean mining in general. Mining uranium has some environmental impacts, although not that much anymore because we know how to mine better. Whenever we started mining uranium, especially in the United States, which was, for weapons purposes, they didn't know about safety measures and so on. And now we've moved away from that. So we do what's called in situ mining, which has minimal environmental impact, but it does have some, just like mining lithium has, just like mining rare earth materials for solar panels has. And so while there is some, the advantage of nuclear, again, because it is so dense, you only need a very small amount of it. So one uranium pellet, which is the size of a gummy bear, has as much energy as 2,000 pounds of coal. I would say it's much, much better to mine that small amount of uranium than it is to mine 2,000 pounds of coal or to mine other materials. And then in terms of the emissions associated with that, several life cycle analyses have been done, and nuclear power is consistently one of the lowest emissions ones. I believe it is just higher than wind, offshore wind, but it is actually lower than solar. And I'll look for that information and drop it in the chat as well so people can take a look. Kirsty, I don't know if you have thoughts.
No, that's great.
So like I said, we're unfortunately out of time. I just want to ask quickly what kinds of engagements you see as necessary in order to realize these benefits for nuclear energy, or build coalitions necessary to move forward with some of these technologies.
I think, thank you for inviting us here, right? This is a huge, it's a great opportunity to talk with other people who care about climate, who care about the opportunity for innovation to, accelerate climate solutions. And ultimately, I really hope that this forthcoming COP26 next week will be a turning point in terms of diversifying the strategies that we're looking at. Because, despite the success in building public and political support for action on climate change over the past 26 years, we've seen just this week that even despite COVID last year, emissions continue to rise, and we're record breaking in 2020, and they're on the same upward trend in 2021. So whatever it is that we're doing, it's not enough. We're not bending the curve. So it's really important that we start, looking at a broader range of technologies, and that's how I came to be here. I want to be able to tell my daughter, in 2050, when she's the age I am now, that there was no technology that we didn't consider and nothing that we didn't try.
Isabelle, any final words?
Yes, and same as Kirsty, I just think that this is one of the biggest threats that our species and honestly our planet is facing. And I think we all are wasting valuable time and resources bickering and fighting over the best solution or our favorite solutions, when in reality, we should be using all the options available to just get over this and focus on other problems in the future. So again, nuclear power has a track record of decarbonizing grids. Solar and wind are super cheap and being deployed right now. And I think these are all complementary technologies that we should be pursuing.
Well, Isabelle, Kirsty, thanks so much for joining.
Can you hear me?
No, I can't.
Oh,
My
yeah.
headphones just died, so apparently the session's over. So thank you so much for joining me today. And if folks have more questions, which I know you do, because we didn't have time to get to them all, I encourage you to visit the Terrestrial Energy booth, which you can find over in our forum. So thank you both.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks.
Bye.